So in this video, what I want to do is take a look at the trade and commerce topic for the British Empire. So specifically, we're going to take an introduction to the way in which the commercial trading system worked within the British Empire. We're going to talk quite a lot about ships and shipping, seeing as the empire was a global endeavour. You know, the idea of having to discuss ships and shipping is, something that's very important. We're going to focus on railways and the importance of railways when it came to the commercial trading. The same for rivers and canals. And then we're going to examine the kind of products of trade and commerce across the British Empire. So not only are we going to cover in the first half the ways in which trade and commerce was established across the empire using the different modes of transport, but we're going to also talk about the trade and commerce, the specific goods, the specific products that were traded and that were popular. So as an introduction, in the period between 1857 and 1890, the period we're looking at in this first chapter, trade and commerce was one of the most effective features of the empire. Don't forget having an empire, being able to colonize and develop colonies and colonial interests in other parts of the world. One of the main purposes for this was to economically exploit the region when it comes to the exploitation of raw minerals and agricultural goods. So there was obviously a massive economic incentive for trade and commerce during the period in the British Empire. So trade and commerce during was originally regulated under a system which we call mercantilism or mercantile capitalism. And this was really a system of where regulations would govern the trading system, the way in which trade operates. And this system was slowly reformed with the less protectionist and more free market approach within the British Empire. So protectionism is the economic policy of using trade barriers and trade restrictions to protect the some maybe internal product and internal economic prosperity of certain groups of people, specifically, for example, within Britain. And so with heavy regulation, we see the way in which trade operated, but this was replaced with the more free market capitalist approach of removing these trade barriers and removing these regulations and regulatory norms and standardizations that would allow for free trade to take place, that would allow for countries to trade amongst themselves. And as a result, Britain and the British Empire, using this approach, this free market approach, which was very a relatively new system, because you've got the likes of Adam Smith and David Ricardo, these four foremost economic thinkers and capitalist ideas. With these free market ideas, Britain became what we call the, quote, world's foremost trading nation. Under this system, the empire would be encouraging free trade. So this is free trade with both the colonies within the empire, the system within the empire, as well as externally with the rest of the world. And in circumstances where trading and trade agreements were difficult to acquire, the British Empire would often resort to threats and coercion to try and ensure that trading would take place. And this is very true in the case where we would use the British naval supremacy. Don't forget the British Empire had the largest navy, or one of the largest navies in the world, and so it was very, very it was a very positive idea for the British to try and coerce other states to trade and to establish trade agreements, and if not, they could use their naval power to threaten such states. And there was still trade and commerce, with places not part of the British Empire. However, there was always a risk that these trade deals may not be as stable due to domestic and foreign affairs. So it was always more desired for there to be trading within the empire, because the British have established strongholds and established control over the British Empire, which meant that trade was a lot easy to is a lot easier to acquire. Okay, and an example of there being possible instability due to domestic or foreign affairs, we could talk about the American Civil War. Okay, the cotton industry was mainly centered around the United States of America. Following and during and then following the American Civil War, the British Empire had to look to places like Egypt, as we talked about in the first lesson, to try and bolster the cotton industry, because the American Civil War, effectively abolished any kind of trading relationships because priorities were elsewhere. Moreover, with colonies, trading was easier due to the harmonization of commercial law across the colonies. Now, this is a very important point, okay? Because trading requires, it's a very legal matter. Okay, commercial law would be different depending on which country we talk about. Okay, so if the British Empire wanted to set up a trade agreement with another country, they would have to get through the barriers of the different kinds of the conflict of laws and the different kind of commercial law and the legal regimes that existed in these different countries. However, with control over the rest of the empire, because they had control over a number of different colonies, they were able to what we call harmonize commercial law, which means effectively regulate commercial law across the entire controlled area. Okay, and this is something that is done, quite often. If we talk about things like the European Union has a lot of harmonization of law, where all the member states within the European Union have similar laws regulating the same things to make it easier for trade, for example. And this is the exact same thing with the British Empire. They would harmonize commercial law across the colonies to make it easier for trade agreements and trade arrangements to take place. So let's talk about the growth of the industrial empire. Okay, so not only are we talking about the kind of agricultural developments and the quest for raw minerals, but there's also the industrial revolution we've got to talk about. As trade continued across the colonies, what we would find would be that investment in the colonies would grow. We would see growing investment, and this led to an industrialization in colonial areas, and that would then further more kind of trading relations, okay, which would cause more investment from the colonies, which would lead to further industrialization, and the cycle would continue. All this led to, by the latter half of the 1800s, so the 1850s that we're thinking about here, 20% of British British imports came from the colonies, and over a third of British exports went to the empire. So trade within the empire was incredibly cemented within the British economy. So now we've talked about the significance of trading across the empire. Let's talk about the modes of transport and the ways in which trading would take place. And we're going to begin by looking at ships and shipping. So by the 1860s, sailing ships reached their highest rate of efficiency. This means that this came with the development of what we call clipper ships, which would be sailing around the world. Okay, we see that in the early stages of shipping and the development of the empire, one of the biggest factors that hindered greater trading relations was the efficiency of the ships that were used to trade goods across the oceans effectively. And so with greater efficiency, greater speed, and greater ability for these ships to operate across the world, the better the trading relations would be. Clipper ships specifically were fast and suited for low volume, high profit goods such as tea, opium, things like that, kind of spices that were used, and they also used to carry mail and people. And then when it came to more bulky goods, the empire would use things like steamships. Okay, so we see there is different purposes for the different ships that were being used. And then from the 1850s, steamship companies reduced the travel time between Great Britain and West Africa. Okay, so And don't forget as well, another very important point that we have to know is the creation and the invention, or the construction, we'll say, of the Suez Canal, which allowed for greater reductions in travel time between Britain and the Far East areas of the empire, places like India and places like West Africa as well. When it came to railways, okay, the historical analysis of the empire highlights the importance of what we call railway imperialism. Okay, so the use of railways was something that was incredibly important for the empire, since it was very key to the economic developments. So when we look at less developed areas of the empire, places like West Africa and some parts of India, for example, railways provided the vital link between the areas within the domestic areas, okay, for the production and the sea. Okay, so not only do we have the sea lanes that will transport goods across the oceans, okay, but we also use the railway networks, okay, to develop inland roads into the colonies, like places in West Africa, to go deeper into the more domestic areas of the continent. Also very important for this endeavour is the use of canals and rivers. So internal river systems were also important for the means of transporting trading products. Okay, now what's important is that these would serve alongside the railway system as well. And an example of this is in 1857, when in India new canals were developed on a huge scale. Okay, we start to see the importance of these canals and rivers for the trade across the empire. Moreover, in Canada in 1867, canals were deepened, okay, around places like St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes Seaway system, as well as in other places like Lake Erie. So now we've looked at the way in which the trade and commerce was established across the British Empire. Okay, we looked at the modes and methods for trade and commerce across the British Empire in this early period. Let's move on to look at what the actual products were, the trade and the commerce of the products across the empire. So the first thing we're going to talk about is agricultural products. So the majority of the colonies were naturally agricultural. And this was with the exception of India, where there was a lot more industry, okay, more industrialization due to heavy investment, like we talked about in a couple of slides ago. The more tropical colonies, like South Africa, produced goods that were not available in Britain. So these goods became very highly sought after, and these were things like sugar, coffee, cocoa, groundnuts, copra, and palm oil. So these are the kind of goods that would be produced in these more tropical environments that would not be able to grow in Britain, and so therefore they became a very highly priced commodity within Britain. And generally, despite the production of these goods being quite small scale, the producers would often sell whatever to the price. Sell whatever price is offered. Okay, so generally speaking, the British were able to purchase these products for cheaper than they could sell within a domestic market, and so they would get still very, very low prices for the products, but they would generally sell at whatever price that was offered. We also see the agricultural products being grown on more large-scale plantations. Okay, and we can look at examples of this. And the plantations were often run by the British. They were often paid very low wages. Okay, and the work was often incredibly difficult and also incredibly labor-intensive. And there is examples of the transport of Indian coolies to the West Indian colonies for what we call fixed time periods. These were usually around 5 years. And the main product from India was tea. Tea became incredibly popular under the British Empire and is still very popular to this day. So let's talk about mining. Okay, so not only was agriculture a very important development, and agricultural goods very important trading for the British Empire, but mining and the raw materials was also very, very important. And as we mentioned in the last video, one of the reasons for the imperial expansion in the second half of the 1800s was this sort of push and this sort of hysteria almost to find new precious metals and minerals across the world. These materials became hugely profitable, and so therefore they became a very key, paramount part of trading across the British Empire. And so there are examples of the mining of tin in Nigeria, gold along the Gold Coast, and places like Sierra Leone, you being able to mine and uncover diamonds. We also find places like copper. We also find products like copper in places like northern Rhodesia, as well as coal and gold in places like southern Rhodesia. So the further out we go, the more to these two places in Africa and Asia, the more of these precious metals and precious materials we will find. All of these discoveries, it was gold in South Africa which attracted the most of the British attention. Okay, gold deposit was found in Witwatersrand in 1886, and this led to what we call a gold rush in the region. Okay, so whenever there is gold discovered in an area, and we see a flood of people going to work in these areas to mine this gold, we call this a gold rush. It happens in places like the United States as well. So we find a gold rush takes place in this area, and this is also correlated with the closing down of mines in places like Cornwall in England. So the fact that these mines were closed in Cornwall meant that these miners had little else place to go, and with the discovery of gold in 1886 in places in South Africa, this motivated a number of these people to travel to South Africa to mine gold there. And this was actually quite a significant amount of people. We have over 30,000 miners went from Transvaal mines to mine gold. And again, so the correlation, again, we have a correlation of English miners travelling to South Africa to mine gold, which then attracts more British interests in the area, okay, which leads to further more people travelling to this area, and also more investment and more attention to this area. Things became even more popular when diamonds were discovered in the area, and the Kimberley Diamond Syndicate was formed in 1890. So not only did we find gold in this area around South Africa, but we also find diamonds in 1890. So finally, we've got to talk about industrial developments. I mentioned industrial developments very, very briefly when we talked about India, but it should be noted that across the empire as a whole, industrial developments were very few and far between within the colonies. And there were two main reasons for why there was little industrial development outside of these big areas like India. So for one, the colonies have comparatively small internal markets. So the economic capital required to invest in industrialization was very often not there. So they didn't really have the economic capital to be able to invest in these quite new industrial developed technologies, which meant that industrial development was very limited. And with this very, very small internal market system, it meant also that they would struggle to compete with the quite vast industrial might of the British Empire. So don't forget, when it comes to free trade, a lot of free trade is governed by ideas of competition. So you have to compete with other industries to try and maximize profit, and this would become very, very difficult when you've got places like the British Empire, just in general, Britain as a whole, being vastly superior when it came to industrial developments. So overall, if we're talking about the sort of historiography of this period of time and the trade and commerce system that took place, we have to ask the question whether or not trade and commerce was good or bad, okay? But more specifically, whether or not trade and commerce was good and bad for the inhabitants of the British Empire, okay, for the people who lived in the empire across the world. And this is still a matter of historical debate. On the one hand, British capital and innovation did modernize a number of undeveloped areas in the world. So with interest in certain areas across the world by the British Empire came modernization, came innovation, came investment. But on the other hand, this development was still heavily controlled by the British. So whilst there was a sense of modernization across places in Africa and India and other parts of Asia, the extent to which this was independently controlled is very limited. Okay, the British Empire still was heavily in control of these areas. And before we finish, I want to talk about chartered companies, because chartered companies played a very, very key role when it came to the economic organisation of the empire. So in 1881, the North Borneo Trading Company received a charter for the purposes of administering the territory. And this was the general practice that took place. Okay, the empire would devolve their administrative responsibilities to these chartered companies, who would then receive a charter from the empire, and then this company would operate and run and administer a certain territory to the point where they would grow in size to the extent to which they effectively became states within themselves. So places like the East India Trading Company and all of these companies, not just British companies as well. So you got places like like Dutch companies that also were very, very powerful. They became the richest, most powerful companies effectively in history, okay, for the time period. And this was and the 1881 North Borneo Trading Company specifically would set a precedent for following companies receiving charters from the empire. So we have the Royal Niger Company in 1886. We have the Imperial British East Africa Company in 1888, and we had the British South Africa Company in 1889. Okay, and these companies would be chartered sort of in correlation and in accordance with the relative interest in these different areas across the world. So, for example, the British South Africa Company was only really chartered sort of around the time that gold was discovered in the area and diamonds were discovered in the area, as something we mentioned earlier on in this video. So I hope you enjoyed this video. In the next lesson, we're going to talk about the way in which the empire was viewed. Okay, we're going to talk about the role and influence of individuals across the empire, looking at specific people like David Livingstone, okay, John Kirk, and Richard Burton. And then in the next video after that, okay, which is the 5th video, I believe, we're going to talk about the policy of imperialism and the way in which imperialism was viewed across the British Empire.